Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite loud. Welcome very cordially to our conference. I'm very glad that despite the early time of day, so many of you could come. I will speak Polish because that's how I've been instructed. We can make use of our simultaneous interpretation. My name is Zdzisław Mach, and it is my honor to be the plenipotentiary of the Jagiellonian University for International Cooperation, and it is my great pleasure that on behalf of His Magnificence, the Vice-Chancellor of the Jagiellonian University, welcome you all very cordially. Thank you on behalf of Professor Nowak, the Vice-Chancellor, for your participation. We are more than proud that a conference on such an important subject, a conference on multiculturality, we can host here in the university, the Jagiellonian University, that certainly without further ado considers itself a very significant element of the culturescape of not only Poland but also Europe. The university is a very traditional institution. Next year it is going to be 650 years old, but it is looking to the future and very eager to participate in the building of that future. The future of every European society is very significantly the question of cultural variety, pluralism, and policy towards the variety, towards diversity. This is the question of coexistence of numerous cultures and integration in this diversity. The title of the conference is quite a provocative one because there is this slight question, and despite it, what we see primarily is the phrase that multiculturality does not work. I suggest that this question after multiculturalism is really a question. There is this question mark. At the same time, we're all aware of the fact that in Europe, at the political level and at the level of reflection, we have a problem related to multiculturalism. Why? The motto of Europe is united in the variety. We are convinced that we should be different in our culture. This is our right, that diversity is a value. It's not only a necessity. At the same time, we know that this is not that simple. It's not easy to integrate this diversity, and the more keen we are on deepening the integration, on us being a political community, a community of identity, the more the problem of how to integrate the variety becomes an actual problem, and it is not easy. More and more often we hear from very prominent politicians that this idea of diversity simply does not work. Hence, a number of questions arise. How many different diversities, how very diverse culturally can be the European society so that we can continue to integrate it, so that it continue to operate, so that we could deal with a multicultural society and not the plenitude of enclaves that do not communicate one with another. In my humble opinion, this is one of the most profound and fundamental questions. It is a great force of Europe and a strength, but also a powerful curse, if I may use such a word, that we have worked out in a number of generations, possibly in a number of centuries, the skill of taking a critical look at ourselves, despite the sense of arrogance that the European societies are often guilty of. We have worked out an ability of looking critically at ourselves, taking a critical look to the level that the incessant dissatisfaction is the litmus paper of the quality of thinking. A true intellectual has no right to be satisfied. They must continue diagnosing whether something wrong is not coming. This is, on the one hand, the curse of Europe, but it's also the continent's strength. On the one hand, we are very proud of our way of living. We believe it gave us freedom, wealth. It also triggered the creative force. But on the other hand, we have that complex that in the past, and possibly even currently, we continue to impose our values to the others, that we are looking only from the standpoint of our own values. We have something we could call the post-colonial complex. The Europeanization means integration. That's something we know, but it is also the protection of Europe against global impact, and this is clearly visible in various European policies. We protect ourselves from the free flow of goods, agricultural policy, but we also close ourselves to what we believe to be the excess inflow of people from outside. We need immigrants, and at the same time we're afraid that we may overdo, we may overtax ourselves going beyond certain limits when we will not be able to integrate the European society anymore. I don't know any ideal recipe for the solution to that problem, but I know that the dilemma is the way of aligning the idea of openness with the conviction that we should not build the fortress of Europe. Discussions concerning this platform, the platform that we share and that we need to be integrated and to integrate others, is the subject of a discussion that took place also when 10 years ago Europe expanded far to the east. So that we could make dialogue with those who are outside Europe. This is a discussion of the values we share, what it means to be a European, what it means to be a good citizen of Europe. The idea of multiculturalism is one that says that if we avoid assimilation, if we maintain the cultural diversity, at the same time we are well-functioning and integrated society at political and economic level. For that, we need a platform of the values we share. There must be a platform for dialogue. Without it, we would be in the threat of being divided into enclaves that do not communicate one with another. What we consider the universal human rights is a product of our Western civilization. Here we cannot avoid a certain awareness of our own values, of our position, of our standpoint for the world. Myself, as a person who is strongly convinced about the liberal values, believe that dignity and individual rights are more important than collective ones. They take precedence. So for me, there is no problem in finding what is more important: the rights of the community for its individual quality, character, but the rights of an individual. But such a view is the product of my liberal point of perceiving the world. But if your point of view is more collectivist and you believe in the value of the community, you arrive at different conclusions, that possibly it's the good of the community that comes first before that of individuals. You don't need to reach for immigrant societies to confront the problem. The people who are traditionally religious within the Catholic Church, for example, face the same dilemma. Traditional Catholic values that put the family over the freedom of the individual. These are some problems that we've always had in Europe. The multiculturalism, integration of a multicultural society, is not only the result of migrations, but it's also a challenge related to migrations. This conference, I hope, will let us understand various societies. We will know where there are the opportunities for a consensus and to build some index of variety, something that will give us an opportunity for better understanding, and possibly one day a better understanding of these problems, possibly. With this conviction, I am hereby opening this conference, wishing you that it provides a great and fantastic moment. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Dariusz Niedźwiedzki, and I am the director of the Institute for European Studies, a co-organizer of today's meeting devoted to the problems of multiculturalism. Let me say that as the director of this institute, but also as a social anthropologist, I find it an honor. I'm also proud and privately just glad that such a project starts today. Why honored? Certainly because, as far as I know, we will discuss a very important and difficult problem in a group of true experts for whom the issue of multiculturalism is the area, the realm of their studies, of their work and operation. For which reason it's a great pleasure for me that there has been such a reaction to our invitation to participate in the conference. I am proud because I believe that the Institute for European Studies should deal with the problem of multiculturalism. Professor Mach, the previous speaker, mentioned absolutely obvious questions. We're living in Europe that is multicultural. If we are European scientists, we should devote more time than before to these questions. And I hope that this conference is an element that does enrich the discussion also in our milieu, discussion of those subjects. I am satisfied just because is now co-organized with our co-organization participation. Now, Ludwig van Beethoven Association is the initiator And I'm satisfied because we're now starting to discuss multiculturalism in a group of people that extends beyond just the scientists or people of higher education, and we should probably go beyond this realm because the experience of multiculturalism is that of every man. Now, a short reflection following upon what Professor Mach said. Multiculturalism is a very important phenomenon, at the same time a very significant social problem, civic problem, as there is no doubt that it exists as a phenomenon in Europe. Simply, in Europe there are carriers of various cultures, not only the ones that ontogenetically hail from this area, from this territory, but there are plenty of people who carry the cultures from beyond the so-called European culture realm. This is a fact, and no one can deny it. If we consider here questions of whether the multiculturalism doesn't work, we cannot challenge this phenomenon because it simply exists. Rather, in the context of many simplified ideologies of multiculturalism, which in a way were not fully built according or on the grounds of what this phenomenon is. What is it, by the way? In this individual experience, it's a clash with other cultures. In the case of cultures that stand in the so-called major axionormative distance, this is the experiencing of alien words. What are alien words then? By assumption, they are something that remains unknown, and if it remains unknown, it can inspire fear, and that is something that leads to aggression, even in the context of self-defense. The fact that multiculturalism doesn't work because it triggers a variety of, we'd call them unwelcome reactions of people, of social groups, of various communities, is just this. This is an exceedingly important and difficult problem of clashing against something that in the categories of values, of standards, of various principles and rules, is something that we would find impossible to accept, unbelievable. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that we will discuss all this here. And the only thing I would like to wish myself and to wish you, that this colloquy here becomes an intellectual feast, and as a consequence it will be able to lead to various conclusions that possibly we will be able to bring not only into our intellectual lives but into our civic lives as well. Thank you very much. Distinguished previous speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I am Andrzej, Giza, Director of Ludwig van Beethoven Association. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. We've got Deputy Mayor of the city of Kraków, Magdalena Sroka, responsible for culture in Kraków. She is a member of one of the panels today. Welcome. I believe that much has been said already about the conference. We all waiting for the first lecture. I just wanted to say that today's project is opening a large 2-year-long project that Ludwig van Beethoven Association is entering together with Ministry of Culture, a major interdisciplinary program whose details you can read from the website. And the website is available in the the brochure in the publication accompanying our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for coming, for being with us. And now I am asking Anne Phillips for the first lecture, Multiculturalism, Cine Art. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I can see that the title of my talk, which in English is Multiculturalism Without Culture, doesn't translate very well into Polish. Multiculturalism Cine Art doesn't sound quite right, but anyway. The questions I want to basically, the questions I want us to ask is, first, what do people mean when they say multiculturalism doesn't work? And secondly, what do they imagine as the alternative? Now, it seems to me that there are three main reasons why people might say multiculturalism doesn't work. The first, which to me is the more depressing, involves the claim that people can only live happily when they live side by side with others who are like themselves. This is a troubling thought. It seems to me it's particularly troubling if you're thinking about creativity and the arts. So, oh, okay, I'm shorter. What's more, I've lost my second page. Let me just have a quick check. Sorry. The idea that we can't happily live with people like ourselves suggests a fear of difference, a need to surround oneself with others who will confirm one's own preferences and prejudices, a dislike of disruption or disturbance. Now, in the academic literature, the people like me syndrome is sometimes formulated in terms of trust. It's claimed, for example, that people are more likely to trust their neighbours, or indeed strangers, if they live in neighbourhoods that are culturally and ethnically homogeneous. And the claim is tested by the now classic lost wallet test, where people send out their students with wallets with a certain amount of cash in it and an indication of where it should be returned to. And then they compare neighbourhoods in terms of the proportion of people who return the wallet, and does it vary according to the levels of cultural and ethnic homogeneity. So it's argued that there's less trust. It's also argued that in countries that are more culturally homogeneous, that are more culturally homogeneous, that people are more willing to support schemes of redistributive taxation. That is, people are more willing to pay higher taxes in order to fund welfare services for those who are less well off, if they see them as like themselves, if they see them as part of the same community. So the argument here is that too much cultural diversity is thought to threaten this, and the limited support for resource distribution between countries in the European Union is sometimes cited as evidence for this. Now, in fact, the basis in evidence about social trust weakening or societies falling apart because there is too much cultural diversity is very slight and contested. But note also that though the argument depends on the importance we attach to people being like us, there's a certain kind of shift, there's a kind of sleight of hand that goes on, in which only cultural, and more narrowly, usually only ethno-cultural difference is presented as the measure. Now, it probably is the case that we, all of us, choose to be with people who are like us in some significant way. Most of us prefer to spend time with those those who share the same reference points, people who understand our jokes, people who understand the references that we make to books we've read or films that we've seen, people who won't disagree too strongly with us when we express our political opinions, but also people who are who don't make us feel awkward by being either very much richer or very much poorer than we are ourselves. Most of us live in subcultures, organized perhaps around our occupations, around our politics, around our sexuality, around how we spend our leisure time. And much of the common sense appeal of that notion of living with people like yourself, I think, derives from that social fact. But the subcultures we live in are typically very small, so all of us already share our social existence. We've already had to learn to trust and to share with many people who are not like us in many ways. So why is culture being picked out by the critics of multiculturalism in this context? In most of these discussions, culture is being used to indicate ethnicity or nationality, as when people talk about Turkish culture. All Turks, all the same, or they talk about Indian culture, all Indians, or British culture. So all British culture is supposed to be the same, regardless of social class, gender, locality. It doesn't really make sense. So I query, therefore, this notion of people like us, right, and the notion that it's kind of somehow there's something about cultural likeness in this sense of national identity or ethno-cultural identity that is the crucial thing. But also, my second question, if multiculturalism on this account is said not to work, what is being suggested as the alternative? There's another sleight of hand that goes on there. People say multiculturalism doesn't work, but really they mean immigration. They yearn for a kind of ethno-cultural homogeneity in which we simply don't have to address questions of cultural diversity. Now, how realistic is this? Even if we now put a stop to all forms of global mobility, it seems to me we're already beyond that kind of homogeneity. We're certainly beyond it in my own city, London, which now has more than 50 non-indigenous communities with populations of 10,000 or more, Polish communities, of course, being one of those. Now, if people like me means white British, then only about 60% of my fellow Londoners now describe themselves that way. Yet London seems to work pretty well, and when it doesn't, it's primarily issues to do with poverty and inequality that are at the source of the problems, rather than issues to do with cultural diversity. One of the worries about the growing diversity of our cities, and I do consider this a real worry, is that people may come to live in ghettoized communities with limited contact or communication between them. What's striking, certainly, about London is that it has by far the highest level of cultural diversity of any part of the UK, and also the lowest levels of ghettoization. The second group of arguments deals with multiculturalism as policy rather than description. So not, should our societies become multicultural? Should there be cultural diversity? But given that they already are, should we be pursuing policies that in some way recognize the significance of people's cultural identities, that in some way try to ensure that one cultural group isn't just subordinated to the norms of another? So multiculturalism as a set of policies for dealing with cultural diversity rather than, do we want immigration? Now, one of the criticisms of multiculturalism as policy is that it is said to impose cultural straitjackets on people. In particular, that it imposes cultural straitjackets on members of minority cultural groups who are the main targets of multicultural policy. Instead of relating to people as individuals in all their variety and complexity, multiculturalism in this argument is said to assume that what matters most to people is their cultural identity. In doing so, it seems to assume that everyone sharing a particular cultural heritage or identity will have have much the same views about life, family, religion, and so on. And what's more, because multiculturalism on this account relates to people primarily through their cultural identity, it's said to increase the pressure on us to live in more time-honoured cultural ways. It becomes, that is, in this argument, a measure of social conservatism. Now, this is a criticism that in fact is most often voiced by the supposed beneficiaries of multiculturalism, people who are in a cultural minority in their society and whose cultural needs are supposedly being catered for by policies of multiculturalism. Some of these will say they don't particularly think of themselves in this way. Their primary identity, they may say, is not bound up in their ethno-cultural sort of or country of origin. They aren't, they may say, particularly interested in meeting other members of their cultural group in government-funded cultural centres. They don't see their views or interests as particularly well represented by the leaders of their cultural communities, and they don't want policies that address them as Turks or Indians or Muslims or Chinese. They just want to be treated as equals. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with this second criticism of multiculturalism. It's true that none of us is simply or exclusively a member of a cultural group. We all have multiple aspects to our personalities and identities. And even if our cultural background has been one very important influence on us, the chances are that we have as much, if not more, in common with people from some very different cultural backgrounds as with many of those who supposedly share our own. And I think this is true for everyone the world over. If we make the mistake of thinking of cultures as closed and static communities, and of multiculturalism as a set of policies designed to ensure equity of treatment between the majority culture, as if that's a kind of like, you know, everyone within that thinks and acts the same, and then the minority culture, everyone in that thinks and acts the same. We're going to fall into thinking that everyone who shares a particular country of origin or a particular religion or a particular culture is basically the same. You know, that they all think X and they all do Y, which I think we just know from living in the world that this is nonsense. But again, what kind of alternative do those who make this criticism of multiculturalism as a form of social conservatism, what kind of alternative do they have in mind? Now, mostly they propose an individualist egalitarianism that will ignore differences of culture. In deciding what is fair treatment of people, they say, we should ensure that no one is treated any differently from anyone else because of their sex, race, religion, sexuality, culture, country of origin. There should be the same rules for everyone, no favoritism, no discrimination, either in favour or against. Now, this sounds great, but actually, if you think about it a bit more carefully, it isn't. And I want just to put culture to one side for a moment and, you know, just think about this in terms of inequalities between women and men. Just to take one inequality, throughout the world, the political representation of women is appalling. Women currently make up just 1 in 5 of the elected representatives in the world, or just to put that the other way around, 4 in 5 of the world's politicians are male. Poland, at the last count, does a bit better than the world average. At national level, women make up 23.7% of Polish politicians, which is slightly better than the UK, which remains at 22.5%. But both of these are still a very long way from anything we would call equality of representation. Now, in sort of checking the Polish figures, I discovered this wasn't reported in the UK media, so I didn't notice it at the time, I discovered that Poland has recently changed its electoral laws to try to tackle the problem of inequality of representation. So amendments adopted in January 2011 require that women make up at least 35% of the candidates on electoral lists for the lower house and the European Parliament. The law also requires a minimum of 35% men, but as we know, that isn't really the problem. Now, I don't know how those discussions went, and maybe you can correct me on this, but I have no doubt that many critics in the debates about this law will have said it was outrageous to discriminate in this way in favour of women, that political candidates should be chosen on the basis of their merits, not their sex, that they should be selected as individuals, not as women or men. But in arguing this, they would be ignoring the structural forces that have produced and continue to reproduce the political domination of men. If you live in a society that is characterized by gender or racial or cultural or linguistic or religious inequalities, as all of us do, if you live in that kind of society, you cannot tackle these by simply declaring that a person's gender or race or religion or culture shouldn't matter. The fact is, it currently does, so what are you going to do about it? My point here is that the individualist egalitarian solutions, treating us all as individuals, ignoring our sex, race, religion, culture, cannot always deliver the results that we are looking for. Sometimes, indeed, being what people call sex blind or race blind or culture blind, sometimes, indeed, being blind to these differences is the right thing to do. But on many occasions, we need policies like measures for gender quotas in Parliament, or provision for minority language teaching in schools, or special measures to ensure that people from minority cultural groups have a voice in political decision-making. Sometimes we need those measures in order to address deep-rooted forms of inequality. So the tightrope, I think, that we have to walk in societies that are marked by inequality and in relation to today's topic, cultural inequalities, the tightrope we have to walk is between an excessive individualism that disregards cultural and other forms of difference, as if these are irrelevant, just as if by saying they don't matter, somehow suddenly they won't, and what you might call the excessive groupiness of a multiculturalism that relates to us only as stereotype members of a particular cultural group. So there are definitely issues there, but they're not, to my mind, issues that mean we simply say multiculturalism doesn't work. The third group of criticisms, my last group, has a lot in common with the second. And again, I have considerable sympathy with the arguments, but not with the conclusion that we should therefore abandon multiculturalism altogether. Now, the argument here is that what's multiculturalism about? It's a set of policies that they're supposed to promote equality. I mean, that's what they're about. They come into being. People started arguing for multiculturalism because of what they perceived as unfair treatment of minority cultural groups who were being required to assimilate to the norms of the dominant group, who were being required to conform to the practices of the majority group. The argument is, however, that in trying to moderate that unequal treatment of minority groups, multiculturalism is said to promote inequalities within the group. Multiculturalism doesn't work in this argument because it's meant to reduce inequality and ends up increasing it. It ends up worsening the situation of what in the academic literature are sometimes referred to as the minorities within the minorities, typically the younger people within the minority group, the women within the minority group, the gays and lesbians within the minority group. The argument is that multiculturalism, in trying to make things better for the minority group in general, makes things worse for those subgroups within it. Now, I actually spent some time trying to work out good examples to illustrate this dilemma. And part of the reason it took me so long to find a kind of sharp example is that there aren't, in fact, very many of them. Multiculturalism is much more talked about than, in any deep sense, practiced across Europe. And there aren't, in fact, very many significant concessions to minority cultural groups. So I'm going to give you just one somewhat imaginary example. So bear in mind, this isn't real policy that was, debated and introduced. A multiculturalist might argue that it's unfair to expect people who have migrated from a country where it is legal and normal for girls to be married at the age of 14. A multiculturalist might argue that it's unfair when that person moves to another country which has legislation which has the minimum age of marriage, say, at 18. It's unfair to expect them to abide by that policy. The age of marriage clearly is a cultural phenomenon. It varies enormously across the world. Why should the majority be able to dictate in this way to the minority? Why not permit an exemption for minority groups to allow them to continue living according to their legally acceptable in their own country cultural norms? Now, I should say, I've only come across this argument in one academic argument in the UK from the 1960s, and I can't actually imagine anyone making it in Europe today. But you can see the general issue. This would be an example, and as you just bear in mind, it's an imaginary example, of something being proposed as a policy to alleviate inequalities between a majority and minority group. But in the process, that policy would leave young girls from the minority group with less protection than other girls against being forced into early marriage. Now, I think it's a fantasy of the critics of multiculturalism to imagine that there are all these policies being adopted in its name that have this kind of effect. But at a kind of more generalized level, there is legitimate concern that multiculturalism can make life harder for the more vulnerable members of minority cultural groups. First, it's sometimes said that mistaken ideas about cultural sensitivity stops teachers or social workers or police officers from asking the right questions about young people who might be at danger of being forced into an unwanted marriage or taken abroad for a circumcision operation or in some way being unfairly subjected to community pressures. Actual evidence about people in authority being paralysed in this way is quite hard to get hold of. But, it seems it's not implausible that this happens. The second worry is that multiculturalism, where adopted, has commonly meant holding consultations with cultural and religious leaders to check that new policies or initiatives don't bear unfairly on minority groups. But who gets to be a cultural or religious leader? Mostly men, mostly older men, mostly heterosexual older men, and their judgments about what matters to their community or what cherished practices define their culture will not necessarily reflect the views of women or younger people and are unlikely to reflect the views of more dissident members of the group. So again, the worry is that some forms of multiculturalism have a kind of built-in conservatism. If we think of multiculturalism as the commitment to engage the spokespeople of the various cultural communities in the process of formulating public policy, which is one plausible way to understand what multiculturalism is about, then it probably isn't going to work for the women adherents of a patriarchally inclined religion, for the gays and lesbians who have grown up in a sexually conservative cultural community, for the children whose parents and parents' parents and parents' friends regard corporal punishment as a norm. The worry is that these subgroups, the minorities within the minorities, will lose out, and that culturalism will only work to the advantage of those seen as the authoritative spokespeople of the group. Multiculturalism, in this argument, will reinforce, not shake up, their authority and power. In his opening remarks, Professor Mach referred to the way in which the Polish Catholic Church cannot be said to represent in its views all of the concerns and interests of all Polish Catholics. It's that kind of issue that this criticism of multiculturalism is addressing. If you set in chain a set of policies in which one key policy initiative is to ensure that cultural and religious minorities are represented, they will be represented primarily through the people who are seen as their leaders. And the people who are seen as their leaders, their authorities, cannot be assumed to represent the voices and interests of everyone within the cultural or religious group. The question again, of course, is what do critics imagine as the solution? For many people, the problems with multiculturalism mean we should simply abandon it altogether. This is not my view. In Europe today, there is a new assertiveness about national identity, not even just European identity, national identity. There's a new assertiveness about national identity, with the national identities often imagined as white, sometimes explicitly claimed as Christian, and with cultural diversity framed increasingly as a problem rather than potential benefit. Now, in this context, I do not think we can afford to repudiate multiculturalism. If monoculturalism, I mean, think about it, if the alternative to multiculturalism is monoculturalism, that is, requiring everyone to conform to the norms of one dominant culture, if that's the alternative to multiculturalism, then it seems to me we cannot afford to abandon it. We do, however, need to challenge versions of multiculturalism that promote static conceptions of culture, versions that exaggerate the differences between one cultural group and another, that somehow presume that if you're a member of cultural group, this cultural group, you will all think and act in this particular way, and if you're a member of that cultural group, you'll all think and act in a different way. We have to challenge versions of multiculturalism that exaggerate those differences, and that thereby encourage the stereotyping of people from particularly minority cultural groups. So we need what I have rather polemically termed a multiculturalism without culture, a multiculturalism that is without this kind of exaggerated, stereotyped, deterministic understanding of culture, a multiculturalism that can respect difference, that doesn't require everyone to assimilate to majority norms, that does try to tackle unfair inequalities between minority and majority cultural groups. If you believe in inequality, you should certainly be concerned about that inequality. A multiculturalism that does all this while also refusing the determinisms and simplifications of culture. So that's primarily what I want to say.
Dziękuję bardzo. Było znakomite pokazanie głównych problemów, jakie mamy w naszym zakresie naszych zainteresowań. Dziękuję bardzo. Mamy teraz drugi wykład drugiego panelistę, profesor
The second keynote speaker, Professor Adrian Favell from Sciences Po Paris. He will be discussing the fact of multiculturalism.
So, good morning to everybody. Thank you to the organisers for the invitation. I hope I can contribute something to this debate. I first of all want to apologise for not being French. I don't know if there was an expectation that because I was called Favell and working at Sciences Po I was French or represent France. I certainly don't, but I will be introducing something about France, but also speaking more generally about about European nation states and their problems with multiculturalism. But I guess I do represent sociology here in some sense, and I want to shift the discussion a little from the kind of normative realm of political discourse or policy ideas on multiculturalism, initially to what's effectively a more positivist view of populations and social structures as a starting point. But in many senses, this follows very closely to Anne's argument, I think, and its implications. But multiculturalism is a fact about European society in this sense. Whether we describe them as multi-ethnic, diverse, pluralist, multicultural, whatever you will, whatever particular term we use, all European societies have become more multicultural than they were, say, 20 years ago. And it's not just the old colonial powers, of course. I mean, the French and the British, old cosmopolitan empires, in a sense, that became more restricted nation states in the post-war period, have long had a kind of multicultural component. But as a result of recent immigrations and a result of increasing global mobilities and porousness of all kind, southern European states have turned from becoming migration nations to immigration nations. Homogeneous, small-scale Scandinavian societies now find themselves with substantial ethnic minorities. Eastern Europe and Central Europe also is facing all of the same kinds of issues. The global era of the 1990s and the 2000s has mixed up these societies more than ever. Now, some of these societies might be surprised about this new condition that they're in. Most of them, in fact, only have relatively small percentages of actual immigrant origin diversity. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about as this huge crisis for European societies is still rather marginal in population terms. But it would seem that we have to basically accept this kind of fact as a starting point. And obviously, as Anne has also been stressing, the fact of multiculturalism in relation to immigration or ethnic minorities originally of immigration nation is only part of the overall picture of multicultural diversity in any of these societies. It might be hoped that this kind of diversity make it easier for these societies to also recognize their deep diversity in terms of minority regional cultures, or their diversity in terms of lifestyles, gender, sexuality, class, and so forth diversities. Homogeneity is really not a realistic picture in this empirical sense, and I would say even in societies that see themselves as relatively homogeneous, like Norway or Poland or so on. But of course, the question here that we're discussing is not only this fact in a way, but how these nation-state societies in Europe, as I'm going to call them, have responded to the question of multiculturalism. And this is, of course, an open question. Now, just to retrace a little bit, there has, of course, been a political fashion over the last 10 to 20 years to dispute and contest the various versions of rather light multiculturalism that had been introduced in certain European countries, and affirm again a more obviously national-centered integrationist discourse. Now, first of all, I want to say I've never ever bought the distinction between multiculturalism and integration as two different models of dealing with these things. If you think about the USA, is the USA a multicultural society or an integrationist society? Well, the answer is it's both at the same time. It's a nation state that uses multiculturalism as a tool towards integration, but it's also an assimilationist society at the same time. It's simultaneously multicultural, integrationist, and assimilationist. These are not different models. These are different elements of nation-state society building, which has taken different kinds of shapes in different countries. But if we look at the course, so the level of these distinctions is a level of policy discourse rather than the kind of underlying structural systems in some sense. But of course, if we start, we look what happened during the 1980s and 1990s. There has been a trend towards a more openly integrationist discourse against multiculturalism. I mean, in a sense, it starts in France in the 1980s. France in the 1970s was quite openly multiculturalist and pluralist in its methods of dealing with minorities. It wasn't, it's not a time immemorial republican nation in this sense. It had its own versions of multiculturalism, but there was a rising republicanism in the 1980s that, among certain intellectuals, that brought back in a kind of republican style of thinking. It was a construction, in other words, of this period. The Dutch then, who had been famous for certain sorts of multiculturalism based on their pluralist pillarized system, which is a particular Dutch national version, turned against it during the 1990s and have embraced a much harsher kind of national-centered integration. The British around 2000 also, there was a famous report called The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain that went one step too far and suggested a post-national version of multiculturalism in Britain that was really unacceptable to the mainstream politics, turned back to a kind of integrationist discourse under the Labour Party during this period. The Danes, the Italians, all kinds of other societies have embraced the concept of integration as a way of solving these issues, often creating things like ministries of integration, as if this really kind of dissolves the fact of multiculturalism in some sense as an issue. Now, I have a hard time here because I cannot see a clock, and I have absolutely no idea the time I'm going to be taking. So, okay. Now, on some level, all of these societies, in trying to come up with an integrationist solution within a nation-state-centered framework, are embracing an obvious Durkheimian, this is in the sense of Emil Durkheim, theory of society, that on the face of it could look quite a plausible solution. Now, what Durkheimian social theory predicts is that the increasing scale, complexity, and differentiation of modern societies as they become increasingly complex in these sense means that they necessarily functionally need to produce more abstract unifying values that hold together the nation or the society at a higher kind of level. So what we get in modern complex societies is certain conceptions of citizenship and the modern self and the individual with rights, unified by certain sorts of abstract values that can bring together all kinds of different people, in other words, within some kind of social unit. Now, this sounds fine in a sense as a kind of solution. This is the definition of integration in the Durkheimian sense. But of course, it presupposes two things. It presupposes an inherently bounded kind of society and an inherently kind of functional system in some ways. And this, I think, necessarily in a world that is moving towards a more global integration, not to speak of a more regional integration at the European level, is an anachronistic vision of the world. There's no such thing as a national economy anymore. We talk about national economies because they're a kind of political fiction, but economies are inherently post-national or transnational. They spread across borders. Capital is not owned by any particular nation. It's owned by companies that are multinational and so forth. But we can imagine a sophisticated version of Durkheimianism that would be compatible in sense with very large-scale multicultural diversity, but which is also kind of unified in some sense around abstract principles. And I would suggest what we need to bring into the picture here is a certain conception, for example, of American society, US society, in certain versions, particularly those that were idealized by the American Durkheimian Talcott Parsons in the 1950s and 60s, kind of created a particular particular vision of an abstract society based on freedom, economic equality, and so forth amongst groups, that would somehow unify the enormous immigrant diversity of this society. Now, of course, what sociologists then point out is that this abstracting, differentiating process that produces complexity in modern societies also stratifies these societies in various kinds of ways, according to divisions of labour, certain sorts of inequalities, and particularly, I think, the shunting of certain sorts of minority or lower class groups into particular functional roles in these societies. And what we've seen across all of Western societies in recent years is a replacement, effectively, of the working class by an immigrant working, a kind of indigenous working class being replaced by an immigrant working class. And of course, in the case of the USA, there's one particular kind of differentiation, that is the race differentiation linked to slavery historically, that still permeates and cuts across any of the kind of ideals that the society has. Now, but what I want to say here, there is a kind of conception of integration here that we could actually work with if we saw it in a properly Durkheimian sense. But interestingly, though, what has happened to the idea, the abstract idea of citizenship, for example, in the current debates about multiculturalism across Europe, and particularly the notion of integration, has taken all kinds of cultural content that has pushed this away from a kind of abstract set of values towards very specific kinds of cultural values expressed supposedly in national cultures, that immigrants are somehow supposed to prove that they can perform or take on board in order to become so-called good citizens. We're going to hear some of these arguments, I think, in a little while from our next speaker. Now, what this means is that new migrants wishing to get access to stable residency or even a modicum of basic welfare benefits are forced now to go through the humiliating exercise of learning by rote ersatz or elitist defined Leitkultur, national cultures of their host nations, in order to prove that they deserve to be citizens, in order to prove that they could be integrated. Now, you can make a good functionalist argument for why immigrants need to learn language, the language of their host society, or a certain range of local know-how, kind of culture in that sense, in order to be able to function on the educational system or in the labour market and so forth. But why these immigrants, as they now need to do in many of these integration tests that are going on in various European countries, why they need to know about arcane facts about royal families, literary canons, sporting victories, or ancient folklore in order to integrate is really quite mysterious. And this is only the start of it, of course, as well as the obvious conditionality that you cannot become a good citizen if you have some kind of criminal record, which is not the case for any ordinary citizens, by the way. It's only ever applied to immigrants who can lose their citizenship because of often very minor misdemeanors. This is also an entry point for all kinds of other moral requirements that now immigrants are being required to prove in these integration tests in order to show that they deserve citizenship. So we get the kind of stereotype, if you like, of multiple choice questions now being put to perfectly loving fathers of immigrant backgrounds about whether it's acceptable to A, beat up your children, B, lock them up, C, force them to get married at a young age, or D, let them go to university. This is the kind of thing you get asked in Denmark or the Netherlands in order to become a good citizen now. This is, in other words, examples of wholesale European colonial civilizing education being reintroduced into national integration policies, devising a kind of artificial socialization device that looks rather like the old mold of late 19th century nation building. Now, obviously, I want to argue this is all hugely anachronistic. It's clearly coercive. It's the operation of social power over marginal and minority groups. It's deeply patronizing. It's about the superiority of our culture over your culture. And if I can say something philosophical for a moment, I really don't understand since when did any culture have a monopoly on morality. how is this possible that we can see people of another culture as somehow being morally deficient? It's a philosophical non-starter, I think. And of course this is happening in European societies that have histories themselves of great brutality, oppression, intolerance, and in some cases genocide. I mean, there's European nation states hardly have a very good track record, I think, in historical terms, in terms of their own civilizing values. So, I'm very struck, by this kind of baggage that's come along with the integration discourses. But what's even more striking, I think, is how little confidence these societies seem to have in their own modernity. That is, their own ability as abstract social and economic systems to produce the kind of modern functioning individuals that are necessarily produced by the sheer pressure of modern society to go through particular kinds of education systems, get involved in the labour market, deal with bureaucratic standardization, all of which everybody who lives in a particular society, whether they're from an immigrant background or not, is forced to deal with these things. The relentless consumerism and self-gratification of modern societies and so forth. These are the features of modern individualism that we all participate in. These are hugely coercive, I think, on our practices and transform the way people behave. How long have I got? I'm sorry, can I? 12 to 15 minutes. Okay. So this is a second kind of point, and I think all of this stuff actually works rather well in Europe. I think there isn't much of a problem. Over 2 to 3 generations, people get heavily socialized into modernity. I mean, in this sense, the modern versions that we have. And modernity, by the way, is of course not something that's only happening in Europe. It's happening everywhere around the world. You only have to spend a little bit of time in Asia or any particular fast-developing emerging economy to realize that modernity is happening all over the place. And with variations, obviously, but in ways that are imposing this kind of the kind of functionalism of modern societies, in some sense, on all members of society. And it's interesting, if you look at the US again, bring the US into the picture. This is one of the reasons why Islam in the US is really not a big deal. I mean, in terms of the fact that there are an awful lot of American Muslims who live an everyday life as Americans. It's not a big problem that they practice their religion in the US, even in the post-9/11 period, in many senses. If you go and look at everyday life in Dearborn, Michigan, which is full of Muslims, they're doing their own thing, they're having their own practices. Nobody in the US is particularly worried that they're not going to become American within a very short period of time. There is a hugely coercive social and economic system that imposes all kinds of requirements on modern individuals. And in America, it allows then a certain region of local community life on a group basis, often religion, which is the Tocquevillian solution, in order to ease this kind of tension in some sense. In America, this kind of issue is not such a huge kind of problem. But coming back to Europe, I think this kind of symbolic and moral overkill of current day nation state societies and their particularly cultural integrationist policies is all the more unreal, I think, because none of these requirements that are being put into immigration and integration tests for new members of society are imposed effectively on the ordinary, everyday, mainstream national populations of these societies. We, in fact, live in these societies in rather kind of semi-integrated ways. We have various kinds of choices of individuals, whether or not to participate, whether or not to vote. We have to pay taxes, but a lot of the time individuals take their own kind of group identities quite separately from national identity. Anne spoke of subcultures. I think we live in subcultures, and a lot of these subcultures are not bounded by the nation state in any sort of meaningful sense. Our modern societies, such as England, for example, is hugely diverse and differentiated. And of course, England is not England. It's a society of several nations, as well as North and South, as well as all kinds of cultural variations. There really isn't a nation-state society to set up, really, as the kind of overall integrating unit here. And yes, I think my basic line here would be that these kinds of integration norms and ideas of the nation that are being introduced simply do not apply to a lot of the ordinary members of society. Not least, of course, because we have all kinds of mobility opportunities, and mobility is always indexed by certain sorts of social status. So the higher you are up in society, the more easy it is to escape, in some sense, the national bonds. My final kind of point would be that I think the real problem for Europe is not going to be multiculturalism. It's old-fashioned nationalism, effectively. Nationalism is the real danger for Europe and the place where huge conflicts can happen, particularly, I think, as we're seeing the unraveling of the European project. But I think that nationalism is compatible in some sense with various progressive versions of the Durkheimian social theory that I mentioned before. But I do think it needs to be conceived at a wholly different kind of abstract level of unity, something more like perhaps a North American type of model. If you're not comfortable with the idea of the US as a model, then we can always think of Canada. It's a sort of nice place after all. I don't think that multiculturalism in this sense need to be a problem. I think Britain and France, in their own ways, historically, up until at least the 1980s, came up with versions of multiculturalism in one nation, that is, nationally specific versions of integrationist multiculturalism, if you like, that were relatively successful in their ability to integrate various kinds of ethnic minorities and even come to a fairly workable relationship with the presence of Islam, for example, which is always pointed to as the huge problem. But I think the real dilemma, and this is a kind of final point that I want to make, is that the world has really changed. The 1990s and 2000s, we've moved into a new kind of global era. There's all kinds of new diversities, new migrations, new mobilities out there. The world is a much more porous and mobile place for everybody. It's becoming more individualist and in a sense flying apart to some extent from the nation-state-centered visions that hitherto held the sway. We have European integration is one of the reasons why this is happening. And I think, therefore, that the real threat that's being identified currently in various European nation-states that are wrestling with the issues of multiculturalism is not multiculturalism as such, but transnationalism. Transnationalism taking various kinds of forms in multi-ethnic contexts where you have ethnic and minority groups that really do not need to integrate in any meaningful sense. They are able, in their own way, to have a kind of a la carte relationship with the nation state. Citizenship can become something that you just pick up as a kind of collection of passports, effectively. And in the context of European integration, it's made it perfectly possible, for example, for very large numbers of Polish people to live in the UK, but live there as Polish and never really think about the issue of becoming British. I mean, it's not an issue because you have a European transnational space in which you can operate. And this is precisely where I think national populations have started to become very edgy. Islam, on the one hand, has changed its nature in these years, because I think the whole issue of Islam in Europe is now not an issue about integrating Muslim populations, but rather how do European nations relate to the massive global geopolitical context it's facing. So it's really a question of international relations rather than a question of integration. And also European societies are getting very edgy about the large numbers of apparently transnational populations, such as foreign Europeans living on their territory who don't really have any kind of relationship to this kind of integrationist picture. And hence we see the rise of things like the UK Independence Party that is not anti-ethnic minority, it's not even anti-Islam really. If Islam behaves itself in Britain, it's anti-Europeans. It just doesn't want the Polish there. And this is hugely contradictory given the massive benefits that these migrations have actually brought to the British economy, which is another part of the talk. So I think we need to look at the future of Europe in this context. I think Europe gave a kind of new kind of scale to cross-border integration and the creation of a transnational space, an intermediate space between global integration and regional integration. And as we're seeing the rise of anti-immigration politics, we're also seeing the rise of anti-European politics everywhere. And our biggest danger is that we might lose the European space that has made a lot of this stuff possible. So, thank you very much.
Dziękuję pięknie.
Thank you so much.
Pan David Goodhart.
David Goodhart will have now a presentation on multiculturalism, rights and wrongs.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I was a bit late. One of the reasons I was a bit late is that I was at a debate last night in London, which prevented me getting a flight last night. I was debating with Nigel Farage, who has just been mentioned. He's the leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, and I'm sure he would be very offended to hear that he's anti-Polish, although it is true he is married to a German.
We love Germans.
However, multiculturalism. Anne possibly touched on the many meanings of the word. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we can go on having conferences about it. It is, in a way, it's one of those words like liberalism that in some ways you want to abolish, because when people use the word, you have no idea really which version of the term they are using. It is such a not exactly misused term, but there are just so many uses, so many meanings attached to it. I mean, I guess literally multiculturalism means a society which has many cultures in it, in which case basically all societies since the Stone Age have been multicultural. Poland in the 16th century was most certainly multicultural. It had its landowning class, and well, I don't know very much about Polish history, but you had your landowners, your barons, a few merchants in the cities, and your peasants, all of whom had extraordinarily different lifestyles and values. But of course we don't mean, when we use the word multicultural, we don't mean Poland in the 16th century or Tudor England. What we mean is a way of describing, usually in a positive way, the changes in Western European societies in the last 50 years as a result of immigration, and the way in which those changes have been managed. It generally means a positive welcome to those changes, and goes along with an idea of allowing people to remain at least, to hang on to at least some of their cultural traditions when they join our societies. The right to come here and be yourself, to put it in everyday language. Let me just unpack that idea. Rather, let me just describe, and I hope I'm not going over ground that Anne covered in the first part of her talk. Let me just briefly describe how I see the history of multiculturalism in the British context. I want to make a distinction between different kinds of multiculturalism. If we're stuck with this word, and I think we probably are, I mean, our societies are more accurately described as multiracial and multi-ethnic, not as multicultural, because, as I say, they've always been multicultural. But we seem to be stuck with this word, so I think we have to sort of subdivide it. And I would like to subdivide between what I regard as a sort of moderate liberal form of multiculturalism and a more separatist form of multiculturalism that emerged in Britain in the late 70s and the 1980s, which I think was quite damaging in some ways. But just to to give you a bit of that history. When we had the first wave of post-colonial immigration in Britain in the late 40s, early 50s, and into the 1960s, there was it was a largely accidental event. Oh, thanks. Is that better? Yep. Nobody was prepared for it. There was a considerable amount of racial conflict and racial discrimination against the mainly Caribbean and South Asian and African people that came in that period. And the response of politics and the state after 10 or 15 years, was to try and impose a kind of colourblind liberalism, saying everybody is equal in this society, and everybody must be treated equally. And we had the first wave of anti-discrimination laws, a great reforming Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, in 1965, and then later in 1968, and then in the 1970s there were more of these laws. Of course, the ideology, the idea of colourblind liberalism applied to people from different races was a good idea, and it was in our statute books, but of course it didn't happen on the streets, at least not the whole time. People in the back streets of Leicester or Nottingham or parts of London did not accept the idea of equality. And minority Britain felt often rightly, understandably excluded from many parts of the society. So later on, in the late 70s, early 80s, you got a kind of divergent movement. You got, on the one hand, a move to make the promised equality, the promised colourblind liberalism, a reality. You got a kind of more impatient and aggressive form of colourblind liberalism. On the other hand, you saw the emergence, particularly associated with Muslim Britain, you got the emergence of a more separatist form of multiculturalism, which said we want equality, but we're not so much interested in equality. We're really interested in recreating our own cultural norms in this society, and we want the freedom. We interpret multiculturalism as the freedom to live a culturally separate existence in Britain, in which we do place our ethnic and religious identity before citizenship identity. We're obviously prepared to make the necessary concessions, we obey the law and we pay our taxes, otherwise you have to leave us alone. We want to the right to remain separate, to come here and be yourself, was the idea. Now, none of this was ever written down anywhere. Some of what I call liberal multiculturalism, colourblind liberalism, was written down in anti-discrimination laws. The other form, multiculturalism has never had a white paper. It's never had a great piece of legislation that's sort of been voted on in Parliament. Nonetheless, it's been a very influential force, particularly at local government level, in large organisations, in large parts of the public services. These ideas have had a reality. It's not just been something that people talk about in universities. Just to stress this point about separatist multiculturalism. So you had these two divergent trends, I say, in the 1980s. You had the more aggressive pursuit of colourblind liberalism and a move towards cultural separatism, particularly amongst Muslim Britons. And I think that partly came about because of what had been happening in the preceding 20 or 30 years, that many of our minorities had become much larger, had acquired a kind of critical mass of numbers, had taken over large neighbourhoods in cities, and it had become possible to live a much more separate life. And sort of separatist multiculturalism, in some sense, a sort of expression of what was actually happening. Quite a large part of the left, the intellectual left, was quite attracted to the more separatist form of multiculturalism. At that time, anyway, the multiculturalist left was very. I mean, the left generally in Britain in the post-war period was very anti-national. That's partly because we weren't a normal nation in the sort of French model. We were an imperial state, and the left sort of inherited some of the feeling about the nation that an imperial ruling class has, which is that the nation is a sort of subsidiary interest, and you stand above the nation. You sort of hold the ring between competing forces. So there was guilt about empire. There was quite properly guilt about the contemporary racism in British society, and that meant there was quite a large part of the left associated with people like Ken Livingstone, who was the mayor of London in the early 80s. And the GLC, where quite a few of these things emerge, although the GLC is interesting, I think it combined both forms of both a kind of more aggressive colourblind liberalism and also the beginnings of a more separatist idea. Anyway, I think I think my basic point is that colourblind liberalism was basically right. It had the best idea. It just wasn't sufficiently practiced in the 60s and 70s. So multiculturalism, or the less good form of multiculturalism, as I would see it, the more damaging form of separatist multiculturalism, had a brief chance, as it were. Fortunately, it rather fluffed it. Well, really, its ideas are not appropriate to a modern liberal welfare democracy. So its ideas didn't take deep root, and we've now returned, I think, to basically a form. Liberalism can accommodate all of the reasonable things that multiculturalism asks of our societies, and I think there is now a pretty wide recognition of that. Separatist multiculturalism has retreated into a sort of intellectual ghetto as well as an actual ghetto in some ways. It's not. I mean, I think to be fair to. Liberalism is often seen by multiculturalists as inadequate, as unable to. As too individualist, as Anne was saying. I think it can have that tendency, but I think in practice, the kind of colourblind, I would like to call it colourblind liberalism plus, was practiced in Britain, and still is in some ways, so that it can also accommodate the special needs of particular groups. I mean, the classic example of this was the Indian Sikh population who came to Britain. And when we had legislation passed in the 1970s requiring that people riding motorbikes wore crash helmets, which would have interfered with the right to wear a turban, there was a kind of rule and exemption liberalism applied. You feel very strongly about this, okay, you don't have to wear a helmet, you can wear your turban when you ride a motorbike. And Muslim religious practices were accommodated in public services gradually. I mean, it took time, there were battles over many of these things, but that is sort of what happened, and liberalism adapted to populations with different religious and other interests. But as I say, the separatist variant was really killed off by the Muslim extremism of the first part of the 2000s, 9/11, the 7/7 bombing in London. And this, I think, rather belatedly woke up a lot of people on on the centre-left. Labour was in power at the time. It woke up a lot of people on the centre-left to just how much separatism had been developing in some of our towns and cities. And there was a rethink. And I think there was also a realisation that the idea of national identity was not something for sort of reactionary troglodytes, that national identities are actually rather useful things, particularly when your society becomes both more individualistic and more divided by ethnicity. We also had, in the intellectual world, Robert Putnam, who most of you probably know about, his work was coming out in the mid-2000s about how ethnic fragmentation in American districts created a sharp declines in trust, and how he described how even within groups in fragmented areas, trust declined, and you had this phenomenon of what he called hunkering down. So I think that the functional importance of having more common norms, shared values, even in a liberal society that can accommodate a lot of difference, we came to a new balance, and I think we're now in a much healthier position. We had a sort of kind of separatist multiculturalist sort of diversion for a decade or two, and I think we've now rebalanced. I think perhaps to some extent, unlike the two previous speakers, I think that's a very good thing. The world is made up both of individuals, but also all individuals have come from groups. We belong to different groups. We have traditions. We belong to nations. These things remain very important to people. I think it's something that highly educated people, particularly from liberal and left-wing traditions, which have often been suspicious of the nation-state, often underestimate the importance of these kinds of group identities to people. Sociologists, I think, talk about the distinction between achieved and ascribed identities, and I think most people in universities have achieved identities. They've passed exams and gone to good schools and good universities and have good careers, and their sense of themselves comes from their own success and achievement, and they can move around the world without feeling any sense of loss. They sort of carry their identities are more portable, if you like, but for many people their identities are called ascribed. That their identities are much more associated with place and with group, and their identities are much more susceptible to being disturbed when their place changes a lot. Through immigration or whatever else that might be. So I think there is. I think we kind of understand these things a bit better than we did. We were kind of learning back at the end of the last century. I think we made some mistakes. I think the left has shifted on some of these issues. There's a realization that if we live in liberal welfare democracies, we have huge levels of interconnection, often not captured in some ways by the traditional tenets of liberalism. We have a stake in each other's success and failure in a welfare state. We pay large parts of our income to the state every year in taxes, and we receive public services. And how our fellow citizens sort of behave, does have some bearing on all of this. I think there is a recognition that the combination of individualism and ethnic fragmentation is threatening to social democracy, to a generous welfare state, and we're seeing, I think, some evidence of that now in the United Kingdom, where there has been a huge decline in support for social security. Not for the welfare state as a whole, not for the National Health Service, not for most public services, but for the social security spending on unemployment, on housing benefit, on income support, the benefits that go mainly to poorer people. There has been a huge decline over the last 20 years, and I think that is partly because people no longer identify themselves so much. I know there are other reasons for this, affluence and a more mobile society and so on, but I think the fact that we have become a more distant society, partly because of rapid demographic change, and I think there is a danger of losing the kind of underlying sense of mutual regard that really makes a good society, that makes a good country. And as I said, I think a lot of people have realised that, and we've pulled back. I mean, some of the things that Adrian was being rather dismissive about, the citizenship tests, language tests, and so on. They're largely symbolic things, but I think they're important and good symbols. And I think in the Olympic Games last year, there was I think a very important breakthrough in some ways towards a kind of new story about Britain as a country that was a rather progressive and open one. Danny Boyle, the film director, wrote the opening ceremony to the Olympics, and I think it wonderfully, in a way that it was very hard for politicians to do, he captured something about modern Britain, presented it obviously in a rather flattering, self-flattering light. But he described a country, with a great history and great traditions, but also one that was comfortable with itself, that was open to others. The ethnic minority Britons were it wasn't a multiculturalist, at least certainly not in a sort of strong multiculturalist, centre-multiculturalist story at all. It was a sort of, you might say, a liberal national story. There were black and brown Britons in the story, but very unself-consciously. They were not in any way sort of separate. And I think it really struck a chord. It was very popular. It managed to appeal to both left and right, young and old, white and non-white Britons. So I think we've come through a kind of multiculturalist moment, a strong multiculturalist moment. We've drawn back from it. I think much of what was required to integrate the offer that a decent society makes to newcomers, about treating them equally, allowing them to retain many of their traditions, but equally encouraging them to join the mix, to integrate into the society, I think is sort of where the new common sense is. I think the left has recognised that too, and the left's sort of beginning to recognise that it has exaggerated the dangers of nationalism, I think. It's true that we do have a lot of populist parties. In many cases, I think they are responding to the failures of liberal political elites, but I think that the nation is certainly in the UK, where our populism takes the relatively mild form of Nigel Farage. I think that the idea that the nation is about to sort of rise in some malevolent form, I think it's been so completely transformed in the last 2 or 3 generations. You might even say it's been sort of feminized. I mean, the nation state is much more about sort of hearth and home. It's about far more about child benefit levels than it is about how big your fleet is, as it was still 100 years ago. Anyway, so I think there's also a tendency on parts of the left to underestimate how open many of our societies, certainly British society, has become, and how much less racist we have become in particularly the last 20 or 30 years. I've just written a book about post-war immigration to Britain called The British Dream, and I spent quite a lot of time looking at all the data on the outcomes for the different large minority groups in Britain. And for many of them, if not most, the average outcomes now in education and employment terms is better than the white average. Not just sort of poor whites, it's better than the white average. For Chinese, Hindu Indians, Sikh Indians, many black Africans do better now in educational and employment terms than the white majority. This openness is in some ways a triumph of liberalism, or one might say liberal multiculturalism, but it certainly has not required the victory of the, I think, more damaging form of separatist multiculturalism that we sort of flirted with in the 80s and the 90s. Perhaps I should stop there. I have a few points of response to Anne and Adrian, but how long have I been? I also, like Adrian, don't seem to possess a watch. Yeah. How long have I spoken for? Long enough.
No, 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Shall I just make a few? I responded a little bit to some of your points already, but I did agree very much with Anne's distinction between that multiculturalism, or I would really like to just call it liberalism, liberalism with special sensitivity to minorities, as it were, has to try and drive that, try and achieve that balance between an excessive individualism and an excessive groupism, as Anne put it. I absolutely agree with that. And I think one way of thinking about the issue of integration, which is in some ways inseparable from talking about multiculturalism. If multiculturalism is about essentially the management of majority-minority relations, then obviously another way of talking about it, in a way, is talking about integration and segregation. And I think one definition, perhaps, of an integrated society is one in which you have a convergence of life chances between the main groups in a society without a convergence of lifestyles. So it acknowledges and it allows for separate kinds of life in a context of equal life chances. I think one has to enter some caveats to that. Certain kinds of different lifestyles are going to make it very difficult to achieve the equality of life chances. Particularly the least successful minorities in Britain are mainly those from traditional conservative rural Muslim backgrounds in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Somalia, and there are certain practices and certain aspects of that conservative culture, cousin marriage, importing spouses who don't speak the language, so you have what's called the first generation in every generation problem, so kids grow up not learning English properly, and those groups do worse than the white British average. So there are kind of limits to how much, if you want to achieve, as far as possible, equality of life chances, then having a completely laissez-faire approach to lifestyles is not always going to work. But as I said, I very much agreed with Anne's point on that. I've rather disagreed with her about what she said about London. The highest diversity in the country and the lowest ghettoisation. London is also very ghettoised. I've got some
empirical report I read,
written by a social scientist with an agenda, I expect. I've read many reports too, and I, like Anne, I live in London, and I go to places like Tower Hamlets and Southall, which are where there is very little common life being created across ethnic boundaries. They're very mono-ethnic minority places. There's a figure I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's something like about half of Asian Brits in London live in majority white areas, but only a third of Asian kids go to majority white schools. I mean, we have a lot of segregation in schooling, not just in London, but London's sort of self-image as this extremely successful multi-racial city is not always true. And I think Anne was talking interestingly about what I call community elder multiculturalism, the really sort of conservative stuff, and saying, I agreed with her. She said it's very hard to sort of find hard evidence for some of this, but one place one can go, it's even here, it's very hard to know the full extent of it, but there are organisations, I'm sure Anne knows, Jasvinder Sangera, who runs an organisation dedicated to helping mainly South Asian women escaping from forced marriages, from various kinds of honour crime, and so on. And this, her organisation receives 600 calls a month, I think it is, new fresh calls a month, which gives you sort of some idea. Even then, it's sort of hard to get a handle on how big a problem this is in particularly South Asian communities. But I think that there are big issues there, which relates in a way to what Adrian was saying about relativism. Most multicultural philosophers are not actually relativists, at least as far as I understand it. People like Bhikkhu Parekh, Will Kimlicka are not relativists. They acknowledge that some countries work better than others. Doesn't mean to say that the people who live in them are morally superior to those who live in failing countries. But one of the reasons for large-scale immigration is that people are leaving poorer countries that are unsuccessful. And that is it's partly because of their histories, and we have played a role in that. In some cases, as their colonial master. But there's a sort of irony here that. And separatist multiculturalism was partly responsible for encouraging this, introducing into rich, liberal, successful societies the very values, the very practices, such as sort of clan and caste thinking, which have made a disaster of the societies that people are. The very reason people want to come to Britain from Pakistan, say, is because clan and caste thinking has made such a mess of Pakistan, and yet they want the right to bring that same thinking to Britain. So I think there is an issue there. Anyway, let me stop there, and thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo i mamy w tej chwili.
Now we have 45 minutes for the discussion. Very decent amount of time, also thanks to our speakers being eager to keep to the time limits provided. And let's do it like that. The discussion really started between the members of this first panel. I think it could be good if we started this discussion now. I will ask those of you who would like to take the floor to do it, and I'd like you to just give your full name and possibly the institution you represent so that we know who is talking. Naturally, we also give, and this is something that I'm very keen on, an opportunity. So we really ask our members of the panel that they also continue this dialogue between them, something that they already started doing.
Following what I said, we're just beginning the discussion. Yes, you have been following. Yes, okay, fine. Także zaczynamy w tej chwili dyskusję.
Let the discussion begin. Who would like to be the first to ask a question or maybe provide some comment?
the Institute of European Studies here in Kraków. I am also from that little country up north called Canada that's supposed to be this multicultural haven. Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations. Actually, two points to make specifically between David and Adrian. David, I was hoping for a more scathing approach to multiculturalism, but hopefully we can get into that.
I just started.
You just started, great. The first thing I want to ask is about this. You were talking about this separatist multiculturalism that came about in the UK, and you did point out that actually it wasn't written down anywhere, and I would agree with that, because I haven't, as far as I've researched, found it in any policies in race relations or elsewhere. And I think one, maybe a point and then a question. I think a point is in Canada, multiculturalism, it's been generally accepted, and actually by both, it's a bipartisan, by not only liberals but also the conservatives that are now in power have embraced multiculturalism. Also within the integration, actually we have tests in Canada as well. That would be my second point, and that multiculturalism has been embraced. It has been completely rejected by the Conservative government in the UK, as elsewhere in Europe, in countries that haven't even practiced multiculturalism. Maybe the point is and I think, Anne, you touched upon it, multiculturalism is a very it's a very hard word. It's a very difficult topic. And one thing, coming from Canada, actually multiculturalism is very concrete. It's a concrete set of policies that were instituted into laws in Canada. And nowhere in there was there this kind of separatist form of multiculturalism, or nothing in the official language that implied separatist multiculturalism. I think that's something that happens in a multicultural society. My question would be, what would happen in the UK had race relations or multicultural policies, let's say broadly speaking, hadn't happened? Do you think that separatist multiculturalism wouldn't have happened either? Is separatist multicultural, because it seems in the criticism of multiculturalism that actually these forms of separation, this form of essentialization of cultures, these problems of minorities within minorities are actually a problem directly of multicultural policies, or more multiculturalism policies. Is this your point? Question is this right? And the question is, what would happen had we not had this idea of multiculturalism, or liberal multiculturalism, how you've described it? And maybe I'll stop there for the moment.
Konrad Pędziwiatr,
University of Economics. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. I wanted to ask first Anne about dangers. You've talked about dangers of thinking about multiculturalism with its kind of static culture concept. And what you've nicely presented, I think, it's some of these ideas obviously were nicely put by Okin in her Multiculturalism is Bad for Women, a lot of the other arguments that you've mentioned rightly. I was wondering whether there is, whether you see any dangers in this great emphasis on social cohesion nowadays in the policies at the national level, especially in Great Britain, but also elsewhere, and whether this emphasis on social cohesion is not not trying. It's not sort of a disguised version of monoculturalism, in a sense, and whether possibly super diversity, which is a sort of a key trendy concept now, whether this could be a way out, a sort of conceptual but also a policy tool, not to get into a trap of monoculturalism, whether there are any chances. A question to Adrian, first a comment. I really like your work, and when you talk about the situation of Muslims in the US, and you talked about that there are no problems with the integration of Muslims in the US, and you talk about a coercive system that integrates them, but there is one important thing that must be mentioned here, namely these are completely different Muslim communities. The class, cultural capital of the people who went to and live in the US is completely different from those communities that came over to Europe. You've talked about integration of Muslims in Europe. I believe I did my PhD on new Muslim elites in European cities. I believe one of the major reasons why we don't talk about integration of Muslims is that it doesn't make sense. In the case of second and third and fourth generation that we're now dealing with, this whole policy and discourse, this whole narrative doesn't make sense, because these people cannot be integrated because they are full citizens of European societies. So this is one of the reasons I believe this whole discourse was dropped. The specific question to you is, what are the key changes in multicultural policies on the ground that you have so beautifully analyzed in your philosophies of integration in the case of France and Britain within the last decade? And what are the key differences that you see? That would be the specific question to you. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czy jeszcze, może jeszcze...
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Maybe we can tackle another one. Jacek Bolica, Institute of Pedagogics, the Jagiellonian University. My question is of practical nature, and I'd like to address it to Anne. It concerns the example you quoted, the example of married couples and legislation of different age limits for those respecting various cultures. What is your position on the solution of this dilemma? That's my question. Thank you very much. Maybe now we let members of our panel to speak up.
Just to answer the first very interesting question, I mean, I think just as a general comment, I sort of rather reject this idea. Multiculturalism, as we all know, is an incredibly fluid thing and impossible really to define, or there's so many different definitions. But we can waste all day doing definitional stuff. But I think, when you say something like, multiculturalism has been rejected in Britain and embraced in Canada, I don't think we should really talk like that. I think actually the difference is when you look at it between Britain and Canada, or even within Europe, we enormously exaggerate really quite small differences, even between Britain and France. If you look at lived experience, the lived experience of a Kashmiri Pakistani in Bradford, and a Moroccan in the suburbs of Paris, and a Turk in Berlin. The lived experience will probably be relatively similar. There'll be slightly different rules, obviously. There's the whole the kind of integrationist story in France, and arguments about headscarf, hijabs, and so on. But I think, we all live in societies where we believe in equal rights. We don't always necessarily practice that fully. And the immigrant, I think Britain probably has a slightly more successful record, actually, in terms of immigrant mobility than some other European countries. The really big difference between Britain and indeed the whole of Europe and Canada is that Canada was absolutely ruthlessly selective about who it let in. In a way, you might say that Europe was far more generous in its immigration policy. It was true, it was tied up with colonial obligations, but we took in the wretched of the earth, and you only took in PhDs. The difference between those two experiences, tells us a lot. I mean, that's far more important. We took in the wretched of the earth, and then didn't have the self-confidence to integrate them in our societies, because the idea of national identity was at a low ebb. In Britain, there was it was less of a low ebb in Britain than in sort of France, Germany, Italy, but we had a more fuzzy and complicated story about national identity anyway. So I think that's what I would say to that. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, the other part of your question about what's the evidence for separate. I mean, as I said, there was never any policy. It was an attitude of mind in a way, but a very influential attitude of mind. Very influential attitude of mind. I mean, you can point to, there was a famous education report in 1985 that said, minority children should study their own history, and one could argue about that. I mean, perhaps there is a case for it. I mean, but I think on the whole, they have become Brits. They should study British history, and perhaps with have some. They should study British history first. I think would be a kind of liberal approach, a liberal integrationist approach. Other things like translating documents rather than teaching people to speak English. Now, obviously, for a transitional period when people can't speak English, you need documents to be translated when it comes to important things like the health service. But I think there was an idea that it was legitimate for people to go on in perpetuity living inside their own language in our society, which again, you might say in the case of elderly South Asian women, that's going to happen. But there certainly was. I mean, lots of more separatist multiculturalists in the 1980s would have thought that it was really quite oppressive to make immigrants learn English. An attitude of mind, some evidence for it, in what local authorities were doing. It's partly also through what they didn't do. It was partly about, separatist multiculturalism, as I said a few minutes ago, was partly reflecting facts on the ground, as it were, that the new critical mass that was emerging, which meant that you had, entirely Muslim schools in places like Bradford, and when they became entirely Muslim, they established Muslim rules for those schools, not unreasonably. They had halal meat, and they separated girls and boys and certain things. So, but that was a function of critical mass, and really just an expression of laissez-fairness, or the lack of an integrationist culture at that time.
Okay, thanks. I'll also say something about Carolina's question, because it allows me to take issue with one of the things that David said in his talk. Have I got this switched on? Yeah. The question about to what extent some kind of separatist multiculturalism would have come into existence, whether or not one had had a discourse of multiculturalism. It seems to me that what you have at the moment is. I don't think separatist multiculturalism is the right term for it, but you certainly have within some particularly Muslim communities within Europe, you have there's a sort of more assertive resistance to what they see as the outside culture. So sort of members of the community wanting more and more of their young children to be in schools where they basically are protected from the influences of modern culture. So there's a kind of separatism that is developing there. It's hugely contested within the Muslim communities. If you have opinion polls of young people, they want to go to integrated schools. Young Muslim people want to go to integrated schools. They don't want this. But there is a certain movement there. I don't think it's anything to do with multiculturalism. I think, as Adrian suggested, it's more closely linked to what's happening in global politics in relation to Islam. I really take issue with David at the idea that there was this phenomenon of separatist multiculturalism. I think Ken Livingstone would be very surprised to hear himself described in this way. I think the two kinds of separatism that happened in Britain were geographical, which partly relates, as you say, to laissez-faire housing policy, and schools. And the schools has been hugely increased, unfortunately, over recent years, with the increase in more and more free schools, religious-based schools, which are actually creating more separatism in relation to schooling. But I think as a philosophy, I certainly find, I mean, I was in the left in these days, and I certainly, the image of a very substantial proportion of the British left endorsing separatist multiculturalism doesn't fit for me. On the second question about the dangers in kind of current discourses about social cohesion, and whether a new kind of discourse of diversity might be the way of sort of super diversity might be the way through that. I mean, I think that the issues that one is engaging with multiculturalism are best understood in terms of equality rather than diversity. It seems to me that multiculturalism comes into the picture as a recognition that there are failures in the kind of simply saying we're all equal now, simply saying your culture doesn't matter, your race doesn't matter. You know, that there are dangers in that that it disguises huge inequalities. So I think that the focus really is much better on, you know, there are continuing problems of inequality across a whole range of things. What are the best kinds of ways of addressing these? Sometimes they will be culture blind ways, sometimes they won't. So for me, that's the better way forward. But you know, I mean, I think there are clearly the social cohesion discourse is a much more socially conservative discourse, it seems to me. And then the question about questions about age limits, and just to reiterate, my particular example was an imaginary example. But I think I mean, I have no problems with there being national legislation on matters like the minimum age of marriage, permitting, abortion, permitting divorce, prohibiting polygamy. I have no problem with that. I mean, all of those things are, in a sense, cultural, in the sense that they have emerged through, countries have arrived at particular positions through histories of debate which have, you know, reflected the particular history and politics of certain countries. So they are all cultural. I have no problem about those being matters of legislation. I think that's a kind of largely a false dilemma. The bigger issue is how you deal with the various more not so much the kind of the overt criminal acts of people, easy to deal with people who break the law, that's relatively straightforward. It's more to do with areas where one is concerned about possibilities of coercion. I mean, forced marriage is the important one in the British context, where you know, there is very considerable real anxiety about the risk of young girls being, not just young girls actually, 10% of them are young men, being forced into marriages against their wishes by parents who either want to ensure that they marry somebody from the country of origin or various other reasons. The multicultural question that comes out of that for me is that it's very difficult to address that without engaging quite deeply within the local communities. So in the case of the Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, for example, it makes a great deal of help. It helps a great deal if you have progressive imams on your side who are constantly telling people, you know, this is not something that is kind of acceptable within our religion and within our community. And then you're drawn into the kind of, in a sense, the working with and through local communities that is potentially the kind of the very conservative edge of multiculturalism, in which you basically, you make your policies and your initiatives through consultation with community leaders. So you can't avoid it. You have to do it if you're going to tackle some of the issues. But it throws up, I think, some of those kinds of problems. So that, to me, is the bigger dilemma than whether it is legitimate to have national legislation on these issues.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to respond directly to the questions posed to me. I know I shouldn't have mentioned Canada, and I did say if you prefer Canada, because I don't prefer Canada as a reference point. I'd rather we grasped the nettle and talked about the USA as a model, in a sense, for Europe. Because I think on this particular issue, I think the US remains a model. It remains a a better model, in some sense, of an immigrant society that works, that manages to capture the dynamism of immigration and the potentialities of a much more diverse society. I'm very disappointed about these references to Robert Putnam. I mean, this stuff doesn't fly in America. He's coming from a kind of neocon position. He's very close to the kind of Samuel Huntington type arguments about Mexicans. This picture of a society that's fragmented into and facing ethnic breakdown of if it's applied to the US. This is also the same country that elected Obama as president on a rainbow coalition of diverse ethnic interests. It's it needs to be thought in those terms, I think. I think there's lots of things wrong with the USA, don't get me wrong, but on this particular issue, I think Europe still has quite a lot to learn. And I would say, yes, the true Tocquevillian is not Putnam in this case. I mean, it's the idea that there are all kinds of ethnic communities, in some sense, that do provide social power, in other words, social capital, and it's not just white Christian religious communities, effectively, which would be presumably Putnam's preference. But the other point about Muslims, I think, again, to engage a bit the debate with David, I think, as Anna's been suggesting, I think we have to be very careful to not simply associate Muslims and the rise of visibility of Muslim demands in society with separatism. I mean, if you look in the details in the British case, Islam is hugely differentiated. It's got liberal wings, it's got conservative parts, it's got a political part which is highly transnational, internationalist in its orientation. There are lots of ways in which the story of Islam in France and Britain and elsewhere has been also a story of reconciliation and of moderation, as well as other kinds of extreme or particularist movements. I think you have to look into the details of this. It's not purely a story about separatism. Just a couple of elements to respond to this huge question about what has happened in Britain and France since the end of the story about the philosophies of integration, in a sense. Because I do agree with David that there was a British dream, and the British dream was a multiculturalism in one nation that was an integrationist policy, a liberal multiculturalism that built on the kind of successful, eventually a kind of successful approach to former colonial immigrants in Britain that were accepted into a kind of multi-ethnic conception of the nation. This holds up to a certain point. This unified the left and the right, or the mainstream Conservative and Labour parties, and it's still there. The British dream underlying all this is still there for those kinds of groups that had some relationship with Britain, I think, in the colonial sense. But what happened in the 1990s and 2000s to France and Britain was super diversity, effectively. It was globalization, changing the nature of immigration, changing the nature of minorities and populations in these countries. By this I mean, we get people from all kinds of new origin states, you get all kinds of new populations that have no particular connection with the nation, and you get large numbers of populations from countries like Chinese migrants or Turkish migrants in these societies who are not colonial migrants, who are hugely transnational and who don't necessarily need to integrate in the old sense. They have the social power to not do this. I mean, on many measures, the Chinese would be the least integrated ethnic minority in Europe, in various countries. So that's one thing that happened. And the other thing that happened was European integration in a big way. European borders were down, and there were lots of internal European migrations that have really changed the balance of migration issues in all of these countries. The way that France and Britain responded to this, well, the French dealt very badly with the European integration question. It kept the borders closed to the Polish and other East European migrants after accession. It had the Polish plumber debate. It threw up an anti-European movement that voted down the constitution. So it didn't deal very well on that question. It still doesn't deal particularly well. And on super diversity, well, it's not responding particularly to it. It's got embedded in these hugely symbolic issues, for example, about the headscarf and so on, which has basically delivered, I think, in France a situation that's the same as in the Netherlands now. The more you try to ban these things, or the more you try to control them in the public space, the more that they crop up as political statements. And so, I don't think we've ever seen so many foulards being worn in France as we do now. And when you see them, they're a form of political identity. They're a form of feminist identity. It's women's politics in some. They're fashion statements quite a lot of the time, and maybe occasionally they're oppressive symbols. But you can't say anything from the point of view of legislation. It's an absurdity to try and ban people in daycare centres from wearing foulard. I mean, where does this kind of policy come from? It's pure symbolic politics. It has no relation to what goes on the ground, I think, in terms of the dynamics of ethnicity. In France, and in the British case, and I'm just repeating in a sense what I said. I mean, on super diversity, I think the British debate has found it very difficult to kind of face up to these kinds of issues of transnationalism. So what the British got in relation to European integration and globalization was a US economic policy that was open borders to migrants, which drove the boom economy of the 1990s and early 2000s. Coupled with a return to a strange old European philosophy of the nation state, in some sense, a kind of fictitious idea of national identity that. And there's a huge contradiction here, effectively, and so I think that the symptom of this is, I think, the positions that we're getting now on European migrations, together with an ongoing development, if you like, of the British liberal multiculturalist discourse on the integration of the older ethnic minorities, but which I think doesn't apply so effectively to a lot of the new migrants and new populations that are living in Britain now.
Okay, thank you. Are you, for the moment, satisfied with the responses to each other, or
I would quite like to come back, but shall we? Okay, will I have a chance to come back to Adrian?
Jakieś pytania teraz na drugą rundę? Czy ktoś z Państwa?
Do we have any questions for the second round of questions, or maybe some comments? We can also agree to those people who have already taken the floor speaking together, but we'll do it only if there are no new hands up. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Katarzyna Romańczyk, and I am PhD candidate at the Institute of European Studies. I have a very simple question, which is not directly about multiculturalism, but I think it's quite close to this idea. Which model of integration would you recommend as the best one for the European Union, federal or confederal one? Which model of the integration for the European Union?
Can you explain a little bit what you mean by this?
The federal one, which means that the nation is not so important, because
right, yeah.
When you think about the confederal model of integration, we said that, and we think that the nation is first of all the most important, and the question of borders is quite different.
Czy jeszcze jakieś pytania w tej chwili?
Are there any more questions at this moment? Carolina, you're looking at me with this waiting in your eyes.
Maybe just a quick question to Adrian and again to David. Adrian, you talked about the integration tests as being this kind of mysterious phenomenon that you don't understand. David, you talked about the integration tests as being something good and well, largely symbolic, but something in a positive note. I don't know whether I can kind of start the debate amongst the two of you. Where is this conception of good, and why do you think these are largely good, and why, Adrian, do you think these are largely perhaps using your words, mysterious? And just one question linking, because the integration tests are linked. Actually, there are two versions of it. A second version of it that just came out in the UK. Actually, in Canada as well, there was a version under the Liberals, and then now a version under the Conservatives. The question is, maybe for you, David, specifically, do you find that the integration testing schemes and the materials, do you find that there is perhaps, whether it's a good or a bad thing, or dangers or advantages of them being linked to political parties that are in power, and how that may change the conception of what national identity and what we're asking immigrants to integrate into? I don't know if that was made that clear.
Yeah, good point.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the question about the EU, I mean, that's obviously another impossible one to answer in a sensible way. I mean, basically, it's not a normative issue. I think you have to look at the way that the EU works. Europe is a Europe of nation states, effectively, and we're kind of stuck with that. And I don't think it really resembles very well the kind of economic structures that Europe has in terms of concentration of economic dynamics in large cities, networks of large cities, Euro cities, and the increasing porousness of European everyday life. So we have a European politics that's divided up into national electorates expressing, well, sometimes usually their national preferences in European elections, which is why these things are so disastrous, and then a kind of a sort of underlying economic and social system that's quite distinct from this. So I don't know. I don't have a design for Europe. So the second question about the test. Well, I just put it very bluntly. I don't think that citizenship should be conditional on anything like this, like any kind of test like this. I think it's an absurdity, and I see it. My caricature, in a sense, of the test is based on some of the examples you see in places like Denmark, where this has become a kind of hugely symbolic compromise. Policy basically to kind of buy off the populist right and certain conceptions of the nation that they hold, and they get put into these tests. And I mean, you'd have to look empirically at this, but I imagine the overwhelming experience of taking one of these tests is hugely humiliating. Maybe they learn something from it, I don't know. They probably learn something about the kind of peculiarities of local national culture, perhaps. But I think there's, I also feel that we don't pay enough attention to there is a certain tragedy about giving up one's passport and giving up one's nationality, and I feel, I hear it a lot with, I'm interested in cases of such as the Polish or the Turkish in countries like Britain. These are countries, there's no real reason why anybody from these countries should need to give up their national identities or their passports in order to live in these countries if they've got jobs and are settled in some sense. There's no reason why they shouldn't have a transnational kind of lifestyle in these countries. And going through the citizenship process of naturalising and so forth in the country does lead to various difficult decisions vis-à-vis your own national identity, where you've come from in some sense. And That's one of the areas I think that where these questions get interesting. We should see tests like this, and making naturalization and citizenship conditional is a very coercive kind of mechanism, I think, and it doesn't really pay any respect really to the culture or nation of origin where the people have come from.
Okay, well, I'll just riff on the question of the federal versus the confederal. I mean, my sense is that across Europe, that it seems to me that the biggest problems about the kind of deeper union that a federation would involve are actually economic, if anything more than cultural. I mean, if that's part of the way it connects with the kind of the multicultural discourse, it seems to me that we have a very large European Union now, which includes countries at very different kind of sort of very different economies, and I think that's the biggest stumbling block to my mind about the kind of redistributive mechanisms that you would need to have a genuinely federal Europe. Having said that, I mean, even if we didn't have those economic inequalities, I'm not particularly kind of wedded. I mean, I'm not sort of, I'm not someone who's kind of who thinks of herself as hugely committed to national identity. But I don't particularly see any reason why one would want to have a federation in which being European mattered more to you in every context than whether you were British, French, Polish, German. I mean, it seems to me that we do have different national histories and ways of locating ourselves, and it's not problematic to my mind that should be the case. What's problematic is when that kind of national identity turns itself into a kind of nationalism which either tells a tale about itself which narrows down the nature of the national identity, so excludes whole proportions of its history and its peoples, or becomes a kind of exclusionary nationalism of the kind that Adrian and David are talking about in terms of the integration tests. But anyway, that's my view about federation and confederation.
Great. Let me just answer those questions and then have a very brief response to a couple of other things. If I can, I will try and be quick. Yeah, I mean, I guess we tend to talk about federal versus intergovernmental in the European context. I'm a social democrat. I'm a kind of liberal nationalist. I think the European Union has undervalued national identity significantly in recent years. It was obviously founded on not an anti-national story, but about the prevention of national conflict. And when that story sort of was successfully completed, it created a new story, a much less convincing story in a way, about how we needed to continue with ever closer union in order to have more clout in global affairs and in relation to global markets and so on. And nobody's ever been particularly convinced by that, except for the quite federalist political elites in some core countries, and of course the Brussels Commission itself. But out of that second period came the disaster of the euro. Not the euro in itself was disastrous, but the fact that they included so many countries that obviously should not have been in it. I also would include in. This is part of there's still some sort of underlying antagonism towards national identities in I think at the heart of Europe, which is absolutely not shared by 90% of EU citizens, and I think the EU is still suffering from that. And it's not only the euro is not the only example. I think one of the other examples, and you may here disagree with me on this, was in some ways the premature opening up of the labour markets of the rich Western EU countries to the A8 countries, including you. I think we should have had a 75% rule, which, when per capita income rises to, it could be a bit lower, 60 or 75% of the EU average, then labour markets can be opened up. It's created huge unpopularity and indeed quite a lot of genuine dislocation, I think, certainly in Britain, but also now more recently in the Netherlands and Germany and so on, for very little gain, actually. From a A8 country's point of view, you might not see it like that. But I think the idea of non-discrimination, I would certainly not be in favour of reversing what has happened. I think we should stick to freedom of movement, but it was designed for very different circumstances. It was designed in the Treaty of Rome. It was assumed that not very many people would take advantage of it. These were countries all at very similar levels of development. Non-discrimination essentially says you have to treat your national citizens in exactly the same way as you treat all other citizens of Europe. It sort of abolishes, in some sense, national citizenship, the principle of non-discrimination. And I think lots of people, again, not just in Britain, are sort of utterly confused by that. But surely, what's the point of being the member of a nation state if you don't, at least at some levels, have a degree of fellow citizen favouritism? The fact that you cannot sort of support the weakest members of your society, it really does tamper with national social contracts, I think, in quite a severe way. As I say, you may disagree with me on that, we can. Whoops. Sorry. Very quickly. Citizenship tests, as I say, I'm a kind of liberal nationalist. Adrian sounds like a post-nationalist in some ways. I think citizenship tests are of great value because I think nations are of great value still. I think countries are of great value, and it says to people, you're joining something of value, we value it, we would like you to value it, learn something about its history and its traditions. You're quite right, we used to have a rather ridiculous test which asked you what time does the post office open, and what is the sort of, it was not completely pointless. It was It was a sort of guide to living in Britain if you were on benefits, partly. And now we have moved to more, in a way, more appropriate. People used to mock the fact that British citizens couldn't usually pass the citizenship test, but that's because it was asking the wrong questions. It should be asking questions about the Battle of Trafalgar, and the things that even very poorly educated.
You should meet my sons.
No, it's true. Most people know more about Nelson Mandela than about Horatio Nelson. It's true. Anyway, I think citizenship tests are good, but they should. And actually, the citizenship ceremonies, which were widely mocked by Guardian readers, turned out to be very, very successful and very popular with citizens. I don't know about the tests themselves, but I think they're absolutely respectable and reasonable thing. So, a very quick response to a couple of other things. I was sorry to disappoint Adrian by raising the name of Robert Putnam, but the idea that Robert Putnam as you may know more about it than me, but to see him as a neocon seems a little bit odd. I remember his embarrassment at his findings that more ethnically diverse neighbourhoods had lower trust. He went around the place trying to sort of talk his own evidence down, is how I remember it. I very much disagree with you on the US. I don't see how particularly anybody remotely on the left can see the United States as a model with its very weak welfare state, its very low political participation rates, its very balkanized society, very low in mutual regard. It's a very groupist society. It's not somewhere we tend to think of America as sort of individualistic. It's actually a very groupist society. And I think the paradox here is that I think in order to manage our own sort of transitions, I think we can borrow some of the American language of patriotism, the ease with which they use that language, in which there are sort of symbolic pathways to becoming an American, even though these things remain very, very thin, I think, in American society. Nonetheless, the paradox is, in order to avoid American outcomes in Europe, I think we can borrow some of that language. Just a final, very quick observation on the Muslim question. Again, Adrian or Anne may know better than me about this, but I think there was a really interesting piece of evidence that may have been very widely criticised. I don't know the debate, but a famous, quite well-known scholar called Jutta Clausen, you know her work, did this big survey of Muslim elites around Europe, and in the case of the UK, she discovered that I think 70% of British Muslim leaders, this is sort of people who ran mosques, councillors, leaders of the community, 70% were what she described as neo-orthodox. Is that right, Adrian? I think, and they basically neo-orthodox Muslim leaders basically reject liberalism and believe you can be a good citizen without integrating into British society. No one can argue about that, but I think that that is a kind, that is the product in some ways of separatist multiculturalism. Just a final point about Ken Livingstone. I mean, Anne's right. I mean, it is very hard to distinguish. It's a slightly artificial distinction between liberal and separatist multiculturalism. I think both strands existed in the 80s in places like the GLC. But what Ken Livingstone is certainly very famous for is creating a politics of ethnic bloc voting, in which you, as politicians, particularly Labour politicians, because most minorities tend to vote Labour, you relate to minorities only through their leaders. You don't approach minority Brits as citizens. You approach them, that they can. You think, or people did in the 80s and 90s, think that they can only be approached through their own leaders, and that led to a kind of wholesale rather than retail politics. So you'd have this great lump of the vote that you would you'd do a deal with the leader, and you'd say you can have your social centre, and that brings me on to my final point, which is the space metaphor. I think is very useful in discussions of multiculturalism. It was partly about this question of giving minorities space in the going right back to sort of 60s and 70s, space to be yourself. But I think this is one way that one can usefully distinguish what I call liberal multiculturalism from separatist multiculturalism, is how you use the space. Are you using the space to sort of lock yourself away, you just remain in that space and lock yourself away from the mainstream society, as some of those Muslim leaders are in effect saying they want to do, or do you use the space to sort of propel yourself better into the society? And I think some groups have used it in that way, and other groups have somewhat locked themselves away. Thanks.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much, Madam. Please, that I think will be the last question that we shall ask.
My name is Maria. I'm a retired psychologist. I have a remark to express. I didn't have any intention to take part in the discussion, but there is one issue that annoys me very much, and I would like to express it. And that is, you discuss here the situation when immigrants enter some country and what to do with them next, and so on. Well, to me, most interesting issue is such that, as we recently observed, the immigrants trying to enter Italy and what happened with the boat and so on. There are discussions like that should be connected with the problem of population, of demography. The reason that there are such disasters as recently that boat trying to enter Italy is the fact that there are too many people born in the poor countries. And what is why is it that UNICEF and United Nations and all the nations are trying to feed the children because they are born and they need medical and other attention, and never are men criticized. They are exercising during the night, producing children that have no, there is no food for them and so on. And nobody says UNICEF take care of the mothers of children, but never criticizing men. They are not ashamed to produce children that they know that they have no food for. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Do you want to?
I think there is some sense in that. I've actually just read a very good book by a famous development economist called Paul Collier called Exodus, which talks about he's broken with the consensus amongst development economists in saying that he thinks it's a really very bad thing for rich countries like Britain to take the brightest and the best particularly from very poor countries, which you'd have thought would be commonsensical in a way, but actually the World Bank and lots of development economists argue that it's good for very poor countries to lose all their most ambitious and best educated people. I think it may be one of those examples where very clever people are being very stupid, or rather it's a sort of they're looking for evidence to support a case based on a sort of ideology of liberal universalism. I mean, they're sort of global villagists basically, but Collier has come up with some new evidence which suggests what most people believe is true, that actually it is very damaging to these countries, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, in 200 years' time, when the whole world has relatively similar economic development, these issues won't arise. But at the moment, we are. He has a sort of model at the heart of this book, in which consists of three elements. One is the very continuing wide gap between rich countries and poor countries, narrowed a bit by China and India, but still very, very wide. Second point is the enormous, the effect that big diaspora communities in rich countries has in reducing the economic and psychological cost of being an immigrant. Being an immigrant being a Sikh in Southall in 1960 was much harder than it is now. And the third point is that actually poor countries are getting richer, or they're acquiring a kind of middling group of people who have the wherewithal. More people now have the wherewithal in poor countries to make the initial investment in immigration than was the case 20 years ago. And that is sort of, those three things together are sort of creating a pressure that was exemplified in some ways by the Lampedusa tragedy. But he's arguing that it's the responsibility of rich countries to have good, rigorous controls, not only for their own citizens, particularly poorer citizens who don't necessarily economically benefit from at least large-scale immigration, but it's also in the interests of poorer countries themselves to hang on, to make those societies work, rather than leak the whole time all the people who are most capable of making those societies work.
Well, I think thank you very much. The time is up for this session. Thank you very much, all the speakers, and those of you who care to ask questions, make comments. Thanks a lot. I think we've been very useful and very interesting. Now we have a break. Thank you.
Dziękujemy wykładowcom. So would like to thank the speakers, and we'll resume at 1:15.